Alright, y'all, so today I want to do a very quick news update video about some pretty huge news that happened recently with War of the Rings. This kind of broke last week. I didn't exactly make a video on it right away just because I wanted to wait till more information came out, and honestly, a lot of things got in the way, personally wise, that I wasn't able to make it, so I'm basically finally able to make it now, and I wanted to for sure give you my thoughts on the huge news. That is, we're going to be getting another War of the Rings movie, possibly. This is some pretty huge news. It's also going to be a sort of sequel to the War of the Rings Peter Jackson trilogy and a sort of prequel. It's kind of weird, and I'm going to explain certain things and get into it. Now, how did this all start? Well, apparently Peter Jackson was doing some sort of live stream giving updates about the upcoming War of the Rings Hunt for Gollum film that's coming out at the end of next year, which I am really excited for. And he basically stated that they're also working on another film. And then eventually Stephen Colbert, yes, The Late Show, Stephen Colbert, basically came on board. I'm not exactly sure if it's called The Late Show. I forget what it's called, but he was one of the big TV show hosts and stuff. Basically came on the stream and basically sort of announced they're going to be working on a new Lord of the Rings prequel slash sequel. And apparently the story as it goes, he and his son, I guess Stephen Colbert, if you don't know, is a huge Tolkien fan. I guess he's apparently a Tolkien scholar. I don't know. He's a Lord of the Rings mega fan, basically. And he was kind of reevaluating, and there was famously some parts of Fellowship of the Ring and certain chapters that were never adapted for the War of the Rings film trilogy. And he was kind of rediscovering them, and basically at some point came up with an idea with his son, who's also a screenwriter, pitched it to Jackson. Jackson liked it, and I guess pitched it to New Line, aka also Warner Brothers, and they surprisingly liked it, and I guess they sort of greenlight this film. Now, I want to make a pretty important distinction. This is a very much early in development concept. Now, they had apparently been working on this behind the scenes for about 2 years, apparently, so this has been in the works. It just has never been made public until now. Until the studio greenlight it. And apparently they're going to work on this. This is a very much important note here. Stephen Colbert is going to be co-writing this pitch and this idea he came up with alongside Philip Juan Walsh and another screenwriter who worked on the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. So he's not going to be writing this by himself. He's going to be collaborating with some pretty established screenwriters who wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy for Jackson. And it's unclear. I'm assuming Jackson is also going to produce this. I'm assuming. Obviously, probably not the direct. But my thoughts on this. Now, what is exactly this concept they came up with? Well, they kind of released a little bit of a press release. It's apparently going to be a film that's tentatively called Lord of the Rings: Shadows of the Past, excuse me. And basically, like I said, it's really a sequel, but more of a prequel in a way. It's going to take place about 14 to 15 years after the events of Return of the King. Sam's daughter, which we did see at the end of the Return of the King, is, I guess, more grown up, and she's kind of doing some investigative work, trying to figure out how her father, alongside other hobbits and Frodo, basically, and alongside many others, of course, basically how the War for the Ring was won. And she does a lot of investigative works, I guess reunites with her father, Merry Pippin. They retrace a lot of their steps and events and places they were at during the events of the War of the Rings. And I guess, and kind of the sort of investigative work that she's been doing uncovers certain events, certain characters, certain moments that contributed massively to why the War for the Ring was won. And I'm assuming these events and characters contributed massively to why the war was won behind the scenes, so to speak. And this basically gives the film an excuse to cover the lost chapters and events that happened in the Fellowship that were never done for the big screen. So certain events that happened with the Fellowship, with the Four Hobbits, also possibly Tom Bombadil, which is another major character that was cut from the War of the Rings books, which if I said that last name correctly, let me know. But yeah, my thoughts on all this, man. Now, this is getting a lot of negative response I've seen over the past week, and rightfully so. Stephen Colbert I've seen his show, and yeah, it's cool. He's a huge Tolkien mega fan, That doesn't mean squat though if you're not a screenwriter, right? And I know it's like a harsh thing, but it's like, for example, myself, I'm a pretty big fan of Marvel and DC and Star Wars, but that doesn't mean I'm qualified to write a professional screenplay and come up with ideas for a future film adaptation. It's kind of weird. Usually you have industry hired writers who are talented to do this kind of stuff. But I think the more and more I see more information about this, now I'm not exactly sure about a sequel. This is really, to me, what it sounds like to me is more of a prequel than a sequel, just because from what it sounds like, according to the little synopsis they put out, they're retracing their steps, they're uncovering events that happened in the War of the Rings trilogy that caused the events to happen in those films to happen. So it's more of just a sort of prequel, and it just happens to be after the fact that they're just retracing their steps. And like I said, there were plenty of events that did happen after the trilogy. I just don't think that this film is going to be mainly a sequel. I feel like, to me, it's an excuse to kind of cover those lost chapters that were never covered. Now, I think, personally speaking, it's a little bit of a tightrope, for this concept. Because on one hand, I think if you introduce certain elements and characters and events that happen behind the scenes, number one, they've already said this is going to be tying in with the trilogy, of course. But the thing is, I don't want things to be put in place that actively ruin certain events that happens in those films. Like, for example, I'm just going to make it like a crazy thing. Oh, the hobbits were in a certain location. The Nazgul attacked them, and they were only saved because, I'm just making this whole up, like Tom Bombadil did something behind the scenes magic-wise to prevent that certain Nazgul from slicing or attacking that certain hobbit. It would feel retroactive and would feel really stupid, right? It would just make the events of those movies feel less natural. And you gotta, like I said, reincorporate these lost chapters in a way that makes sense and in a way that doesn't necessarily ruin the organic nature of what happens in the first movie. Like, everything that happens in the first movie makes sense and can happen. It really needs to, the events that are going to be shown in this film possibly need to strengthen what happens in the first movie, of course, but not ruin the nature and organic attitude of it all, if that makes any kind of sense. And it's a very tricky line. I am glad that Colbert, because if it was just him writing the screenplay, I'll be really worried because he's not a screenwriter. But since you got more of the people behind the scenes, apparently the War of the Rings team are going to be working on this, of course. I'm assuming Jackson's going to produce this, and Colbert is just co-writing it, alongside the other screenwriters who wrote the trilogy. That gives me more confidence in this project, but I am still going to be cautious because on one hand, I think, like I said, this movie really presents the possible danger that it could ruin certain events of the films, and depending on how it's done, make it worse, right? Now, in terms of this movie, apparently they're going to work on it this summer. I guess writing-wise, I'm not sure. Now, in terms of a possible production date, like when this is actually going to be filming, we really don't know. I think in a lot of ways, this is still really early on in development. It's just they've been working on behind the scenes, and I guess they've done enough progress they can officially announce it. But, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh my gosh, this is happening for sure, just because I think Hunt for Gollum is also going to determine a lot for this film, right? Because if Hunt for Gollum comes out and it's not really well, critically received, and more importantly, does not really do too well financially, Warner Brothers is not going to make this. They're just not going to. So it really determines what happens with the Hunt for Gollum. If Hunt for Gollum comes out and it makes a lot of money and people love it, then of course they're probably going to pursue this. But don't say, I'm not going to really sit here and say that, oh my gosh, this is happening for sure. This is basically another idea they're seriously going to work on and possibly do. But yeah, overall, I'm a little bit more worried for this one than I am for Hunt for Gollum, just because Hunt for Gollum is a natural extension to the trilogy, events that have never happened. But when you start messing with events that did happen in the films and add things to them, it can be a tricky tightrope. And that's why I am excited for this, just because there is a lot of people who have had trusted backgrounds with the Lord of the Rings working on this. Definitely more so excited for this than I am with the Amazon stuff they're making. but I am going to hold my judgment, and I'm going to be cautious about this thing. So yeah, my thoughts on this new War of the Rings film possibly coming out with involvement from Stephen Colbert. All right, y'all, hopefully a good day, and peace, y'all.